And the first one this morning is Robert Johansen. And I presume, Robert, that you must have come from Minnesota originally with that name. And Robert is the Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame and Senior Fellow in the Kroc Institute International Peace Studies. He has written a seminal book, A United Nations Emergency Peace Service. This is something that's very dear to the hearts of Canadians because it's something that we in the World Federalists in Canada are also promoting strongly. And so let us welcome him. He's also the founding editor-in-chief of the World Policy Journal. Robert.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I want to thank Joe Swartzberg for laying a solid intellectual foundation for this conference. And I'm deeply indebted also to many other presenters who are on this program who have been mentors or from whom I've learned a great deal over the years. Participating here is a great joy and an honor, and I'm happy to be addressing you and thinking with you about these important topics. My assignment this morning is to, let me see, I don't seem to have the PowerPoint advance working. Okay, thank you. This is my question. What is necessary to establish a more effective, workable peacekeeping system? I want to begin with a few preliminary comments about how we might best understand peace and peacekeeping. Second, I will propose what might be the most promising next steps in establishing a new generation of peacekeeping. Well, I'm really having some technical problems here with this computer. How do I get this off of the screen? I'd just like to advance this, if I could, with the cursor keys. I don't know what this is.
Okay, so I think the best thing is probably to use the mouse and just...
Can I use this?
Yeah, you can use that too, but the mouse will be better.
Okay, I'm sorry. The last thing I want to do then is talk about some benefits of this proposal if and when it could be implemented. First, we need to remember that peace is not necessarily an automatic consequence of war prevention. To be sustained, peace needs to be planned. It needs to be institutionalized. Peace today, I think, can more wisely be understood as the result of good governance than as a result of a particular deployment of military power or the balance of power itself. Whether we're addressing war or terrorism or weapons of mass destruction or the possible deployment of weapons in space or managing the rise of dissatisfied states, whether we're looking at any of these, today's security problems can be addressed most effectively if they are addressed as problems of governance. Similarly, war and violence can more accurately be understood as a result of poor governance, by which I mean two things, really. First, the failure to establish adequate international institutions to make and enforce law effectively. And second, failure to represent fairly those people who have grievances and to respond seriously to those grievances. To be truly successful in the long run, peacekeeping strategy needs to be part of a grand strategy for human security. It needs to be organically, really, intertwined with strategic peace building. Peacekeeping should facilitate peace building, and peace building usually needs peacekeeping. Okay, think about the purpose of peacekeeping. This itself has become controversial. Recent UN operations in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Mali, and in the Central African Republic have raised some concerns that enforcement may be endorsing violent measures that can go beyond the familiar rationales for peacekeeping, these three being having the consent of the host, behaving impartially, and not using force except in self-defense. UN peacekeepers recently have undertaken some offensive military actions to attack opposing forces. They've become belligerents, sometimes defending governments whose military personnel have themselves been accused of war crimes. UN forces have taken on programs for violent stabilization measures or to do nation building in fragmented states. Now, precisely when this greater willingness to use military power may be needed cannot be resolved here, but these controversies over the utility of violence focus our purpose in the next stage of institutional innovation on emphasizing prevention of violence, protection of people, and on enforcement of law. My proposals are based on the idea that when violent means are needed for UN enforcement, they should be justified as law enforcement operations, and they should proceed with as much similarity to police enforcement and as little similarity to traditional military combat as is feasible in that context. I'm convinced the UN can do more robust enforcement without being accused of being narrowly partisan, to the extent that it can emphasize enforcing law. The word workable in a workable peacekeeping system means being politically feasible, and it means being effective in peacemaking. Today, I encourage us to imagine a UN peacekeeping system that has at least what is required to keep peace in some situations where violent adversaries have not agreed to stop killing, and where some physical coercion is needed for a kind of Chapter 7 enforcement. I suggest that we imagine, at the least, a UN capability sufficient to protect people threatened by genocide-type actions, such as happened in Rwanda. The proposal I'm making builds on an attitudinal change for peacekeeping that was stimulated by the failure to stop genocide in Rwanda in 1994 and the mass atrocities within the sight of UN peacekeepers in Srebrenica in 1995. Kofi Annan has spoken of this growing sense that the international community has a responsibility to protect civilians when their own government is unwilling or unable to safeguard their own people against gross violation of human rights. In his words, state sovereignty in its most basic sense is being redefined. States are now widely understood to be instruments in the service of their peoples, and not vice versa. Well, to the extent that this is true, sovereignty becomes conditional. It imposes, in fact, an interventionist duty on the international community. So, because the need for a rapid reaction UN capability is widely recognized, particularly now for the purpose of upholding prohibitions of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, a new initiative in this area might be possible in the form of UN enforcement that would be most likely to gain political acceptance. To be politically feasible, a proposal for peacekeeping must be perceived to serve some interests of nearly all UN members, perhaps especially the interests of the middle-range powers who need to push for this proposal. A more robust UN peacekeeping system probably cannot be so large and so easily deployed that it could threaten the government of any major power, or it would be unlikely to be created. It should not be so easily manipulated by great powers that it would pose an imperial threat to the weak and poor societies. It cannot impose any new major financial obligations on any society. So with these requirements in mind, I propose the creation of a United Nations Emergency Peace Service. This is a proposal based on extensive conversations between a number of experts and some former government officials and activists who are seeking to ensure that the next preventable human disaster does not occur. The proposed service could be designed to provide the following functions. It would be permanent, based at UN-designated sites. It would include mobile field headquarters and be ready to act immediately to cope with an emergency. It would be individually recruited from among those who volunteer from many countries, so it would not suffer the delays of creating ad hoc forces or the reluctance of UN members to deploy their own national military units. Its personnel would be carefully selected, well-trained, expertly led. It would provide a wide range of professional skills and be an integrated service that included civilian administrators, police, legal and human rights professionals, of course, military personnel, conflict transformation experts, and relief specialists, enabling it to deploy all the components essential for peace and enforcement operations. It would, as I've said, focus on enforcing international law, using methods of police enforcement, or what Mary Kaldor has called cosmopolitan law enforcement, wherever possible, rather than on employing more traditional methods of military combat, although military action would be employed under some circumstances, but always following the laws of war. It could begin with as few as 15,000 members, but would be preferable if it could have twice that number. The ideal operational context would enable the UN service to have sufficient enforcement strength to discourage fighting quickly, if possible, in order to enable a police mode of operation thereafter, rather than continue a less efficacious combat mode. Now, the Charter designates the Security Council as the authority to deploy peace operations, particularly if they're legally binding and involve the use of force. It is the preferred authority to decide to deploy. However, because indecision or the use of the veto has paralyzed the Council at crucial times in the past, alternative forms of authorization are desirable. Still, if an alternative form lacks legitimacy or portends deployment that could be achieved too easily, the peace service would probably not be established, or if established, it could be abused. The best solution is to place normal authorization in the hands of the Security Council and to ask permanent members not to use the veto against resolutions designed to protect human rights, if that resolution would enjoy majority support from other council members. And there are a couple of proposals now being fielded to try to make this a more formal invitation to the Security Council. Some of these enjoin 70 or 80 supporting governments. But if, despite this suggestion, a resolution would be vetoed, the General Assembly might possibly authorize the peace service's use through the Uniting for Peace procedure. Additionally, the Council might in advance authorize the Secretary General to deploy the service in a crisis on his or her own authority under specified conditions, such as when substantial loss of life seems almost certain. The Council could still retain the right to reverse that decision and withdraw the service through passage of a resolution rescinding the Secretary General's decision if it sought to do so. Additional mechanisms to authorize deployment might include authorization by a regional international organization for intervention in one of its own member states. To guard against the possibility of unwarranted interventions, the following standards, which were suggested by the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, should be followed. A legitimate agency must authorize deployment. There must be a just cause. Intervention must be undertaken with the right intention. Intervention should occur only when there's an immediate and evident threat of gross violations of international human rights. This criterion reformulates the more familiar just war standard of last resort, which makes sense when you're using military combat, but does not make so much sense in law enforcement, because a good outcome might result from early rather than late deployment. This means should also be proportional to and consistent with the ends sought, and a reasonable prospect of success must exist in order to justify intervention. Some observers caution that deploying peacekeepers for enforcement will risk putting the United Nations in the position of supporting an existing state against internal dissenting groups, such as may have happened in the DRC, in Mali, or Somalia, without trying hard enough to seek a comprehensive peace settlement involving all parties within a war-torn state. Another problem is that peace enforcement that aids in nation building seems to subordinate humanitarian priorities to political agendas. Yet, at times, there's no question, UN personnel may advance humanitarian priorities by implementing human security through political change. Now, these are serious problems that should be addressed, need to be addressed in each individual deployment, rather than stand as immovable impediments to establishing a peace service. And certainly an ombudsman should be established to keep in close touch with all parties in a conflict whenever the UN peace service would be deployed. I'm freezing up again. Okay. Although in its initial form it would be no panacea for security problems in general, the proposed peace service could provide immediate full protection in some situations and because peace building essential for successful peacekeeping often requires extensive and long-term efforts to have sufficient personnel to cover the primary role of preventing genocides. It would be necessary for the wider UN system to offer support for any long-standing services that are required, or perhaps regional actors could do that as well. We might think of the proposed emergency service as a first-in, first-out response to crisis, although in particular cases it might continue the deployment of some personnel, such as for training and monitoring local civilian police, after other agencies have arrived to address any needs too large and long-term for the UN emergency service to handle by itself. Another important institutional innovation, which is desirable but not absolutely necessary to initiate a UN emergency peace service, would be establishing a UN satellite monitoring agency, perhaps connected with the IAEA, enabling the peace service and other UN agencies to have reliable information. And this could enable enforcement to be as violence-free as possible. It could enable the UN to gather evidence that might be useful in judicial processes to hold individuals accountable for gross violations of human rights. Now a word about costs. If I can get this to work. Here we go. Thank you. The proposed UN Emergency Peace Service would entail significant financial costs of roughly $1 to $2 billion annually. Nonetheless, these costs would be far less than the costs that repeatedly occur from failure to enforce core international laws of peace and human rights. It could be financed through regular member peacekeeping contributions, or perhaps it could be financed by instituting what's been called Tobin tax, a very tiny fee based on international currency exchanges. Interestingly, the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict found that the international community spent approximately $200 billion on conflict management in 7 major interventions in the 1990s. These were in Bosnia, Herzegovina, Somalia, Rwanda, Haiti, the Persian Gulf, Cambodia, El Salvador. However, the Commission also found that it could have saved $130 billion of this amount through a more effective preventive approach. And the cost of reinforcing the UN force in Rwanda, if that had been done, with the 5,000 soldiers that the UN commander thought were needed to prevent the genocide, was estimated to be about $500 million. Yet the cost of humanitarian assistance to Rwanda after the genocide was $4.5 billion. Let me briefly list a few of the benefits before closing. A UN emergency peace service could offer a comprehensive, internationally legitimate way to meet the need to prevent atrocities, while at the same time it would be reinforcing international laws that prohibit mass murder. It could facilitate decisions to deploy peacekeepers because UN members would not be as likely to drag their feet in making decisions to deploy, since they would not be sending their own military units into harm's way. If cynical political leaders knew that a UN service could be deployed quickly to enforce the law against crimes, that possibility itself might deter some of the crimes, simply because the leaders might want to avert the possibility that the UN force would be asked to enter their country. An emergency peace service could also provide secure humanitarian corridors to enable threatened people to move to a secure refuge, as has been needed, particularly recently, in Libya, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. It could provide mobile police units to help provide safety in tense local communities that need stability. And it could help to retrain their local police. And this, of course, wouldn't have to be done as a coercive intervention. It could be done at the request of a host state interested in helping itself avoid sliding into chaos. It could provide fact-finding. It could also possibly help support international and judicial functions by collecting evidence that would be useful for truth commissions and prosecutions of war crimes. And perhaps even it could assist in arrests of those who've already been indicted by the International Criminal Court. It could protect people delivering humanitarian services, and it could help protect and process refugees. The emergency service would respond to humanitarian crises growing out of natural disasters or environmental problems, especially for countries that are unable to provide sufficient assistance, as was needed, for example, after the Nepalese earthquake, or in helping to limit the spread of Ebola in West Africa. And finally, establishing such a service could be an institutional breakthrough that would educate nations about how to expand international law enforcement as the peace service's positive reputation might grow. It could teach the countries of the world that effective UN enforcement is a realistic possibility. And if UN enforcement succeeded and enjoyed high legitimacy, it might gradually increase countries' perceived need to rely as much on national military means for promoting human security. It might decrease that perception of need. Overall, as Joe Schwartzberg says in his book, and I'm quoting, establishing a corps of volunteers inspired by an ethos of global service and common allegiance to humanity rather than to specific countries would promote a salutary planetary consciousness. I think the time is right for developing more effective UN capabilities to protect innocent people. We see the need clearly in the news almost every day. Various UN standby approaches have been tried and found wanting. Because governments have been slow to act, there must be sustained pressure from a coalition made up of civil society organizations, sympathetic individuals at the UN, and supportive national governments, much as the coalition that paved the way for creating an international criminal court. I think a United Nations Emergency Peace Service could be a clear manifestation of sovereignty as responsibility. As Kofi Annan warned, the core challenge in the next century is to forge unity behind the principle that massive and systematic violations of human rights should not be allowed to stand. To achieve that undeniable duty, a UN Emergency Peace Service would be likely to produce enough benefits to demonstrate that when it comes to stopping genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, the collective interest is the national interest. A UN service could help to end a culture of impunity and produce monumental benefits in lives saved, mothers and daughters protected against sexual abuse, families still able to live at home, time and money never spent to kill and destroy, tolerance maintained in multi-ethnic societies, laws upheld, and communities at peace. If enough people act together, it will be possible to enliven that spark of human solidarity that lives, although often hidden, within people everywhere on earth. We could finally give genuine meaning to the solemn promise, never again. And this could lay the foundation for something further down the road that would be even better able to uphold international laws for peace and human rights. Thank you very much. I think we have questions.
Yeah, no professor needs intervention from someone else. So you have a few minutes to ask questions and get answers.
Up here, Michael? We need a microphone, I think. Sorry. I'm sorry?
You may want to take 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, okay.
In our country, where the emergence of a Black Lives Matter movement was necessitated by the frequent instances of police forces assaulting and killing African Americans. This past year, so far, over 900 African Americans killed by police forces. The analogy of saying it's a police force and doing police action may not resonate so fully with all sections of our population. So I'm wondering if you have some ideas about what kinds of checks and balances, what kinds of protections from an international police force can be built into the proposal for an international police force.
Okay, as Bill suggested, let's take several questions. I'll make a note so I can remember them. Who else has a question?
I have a question.
Ron, give the mic to whoever's...
My question has to do mainly with how is this wonderful presentation going to be made available to everybody? Because I think you have put your finger on so many important issues. I do want to make sure that this is something that's going to be available.
Thank you, Ron. We're not going away. We'll work at that.
I'll add another question here. Since you have the, this is a wonderful idea, but since there are so inconsistencies in human rights, rules and regulations and the establishment of those throughout all the different nations, how could anybody come up with a plan that would truly implement something and establish guidelines for implementation when they can't even establish currently guidelines for human rights or some of the basic needs? And so how would you determine when implementation would be used or so you can follow through with that?
Okay. We'll take one more.
Thank you. Despite the gross atrocities that are happening all over the world, the UN seems like it could repeat the fate of the League of Nations. How do you foresee that they might get past the veto in getting some of this implemented?
Okay, thank you. The first question was about police not having a positive image. Which, of course, is very true. I mean, policing it's got to be one of the hardest activities in the world to do well. But I'm convinced it can be done well. And most people can imagine it being done well. It's often not done well, even in democratic societies that have checks and balances. So it requires a very special, first of all, selection of people to do law enforcement. Not everybody has a personality that enables them to do law enforcement without being too harsh or in some cases being too violent. So selecting people is first, and training them and leading them well is very important. And they, of course, should not be under military authority, as they are in many countries. So a lot needs to be done to educate about this. But police who are acting, who are drawn from a community, acting on behalf of the community, enforcing laws that have been agreed to by the community, can do the job well. And when it's done well, there's a huge difference between police enforcement and military combat. And that's part of the distinction that I'm wanting this new service to be aware of. It's true that there are cases where you need both. You can't just say one or the other. But because of the controversy and the political impediments to creating a more direct UN enforcement ability, I'm suggesting that we really try to emphasize this difference. And if in the first instance it's necessary for the UN the UN direct enforcement capability to emphasize police enforcement, if that's all it can be, even emphasize that, because that will be better than nothing. So the task is difficult to make police enforcement have a positive image, but there are cases where they truly do have such an image. And you can find those, and we need to explain those and tell that story everywhere, not only in other countries, in our country, but also throughout the world. For police to come from a community and protect the norms of the community is what's essential. The question about human rights being so contested and so diverse, how do we get them to be a relevant influence in this enterprise? I want to emphasize that in what I'm proposing here, I'm not talking about what might be considered a full range of human rights, some of which are highly controversial and are not widely shared throughout the world. I'm talking about what are the core rights, the basic rights of international humanitarian and human rights law, particularly the prohibition of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Now, these are crimes on which the countries of the world agree. These are crimes that are so horrible that no government is willing to speak against them or as if they don't support them. I know that in many cases the rhetorical support is cynical, but what I'm saying is these are the fundamental basic rights on which a UN enforcement capability could be based and should be focused in the first instance. And I want to point out that those actually predate any discussion of the controversial responsibility to protect. The Genocide Convention, a treaty, over 140 countries are parties to this, and it says not only that you must not commit genocide, it says you have a duty to prevent. A duty to prevent. So on the basis of and of course, war crimes go back to Geneva Conventions, that some of which even predate the United Nations. So there's a solid, long-standing legal and historical basis for enforcing these norms. And this is what should be emphasized, I think, in the creation of a more independent UN enforcement capability. Now, the third, last question is about how to handle the possibility that the UN may end up being so ineffective that it has a fate that's sort of like the League of Nations. Well, there's no way to guarantee that an international institution might not fail. On the other hand, I'm convinced if the UN has institutional failure, that something else like it or better than it would be created in its place. International organization and the effort for multilateral collaboration to regularize international relations is not going away. We don't need to worry about that. That is here to stay. If the species has a future, international organization has a future. And it will be the UN, or it will be called something else perhaps. But in the short run, we can't do anything to revise the charter without the agreement of the permanent members. What we can do as civil society, individuals and transnational networks, we can insist that the countries with a veto don't use it by embarrassing them and by putting pressure on them so that they won't use it, at least in resolutions that would pass without a veto that are focused on the prohibition of genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. Thank you very much.